In 1847, in Paris, Louis-François Cartier took over the workshop of his master, Adolphe Picard. The handover was quiet, the kind of transaction that happens 1,000 times across a city without ceremony. A young man, a bench, a set of tools, and the weight of a craft he had spent years learning. Watches were not part of that handover. They were not in the room, not in the plan, not even in the margins of the thought that must have crossed Louis-François's mind as he looked at his new walls. What he inherited was a jewelry workshop, nothing more. That is the fact that makes everything that followed so strange. Because 173 years later, Forbes valued that same house at $12.2 billion. Not for the diamonds alone, not for the royal patronage alone, for watches, for timepieces that were never the original intention, never the founding ambition, never the reason Adolphe Picard handed over his bench in the first place. So here is the question that sits underneath the entire story, the one that feels almost impossible to answer. How does a jewelry house accidentally build a $12.2 billion watch empire? How does a craft dedicated to ornament become the measure of time itself? You already know the visible answer, the one printed in glossy magazines and repeated in boutique hallways. The name Cartier means Paris, means royalty, means the kind of luxury that does not need to announce itself. But the invisible answer, the one buried in ledgers and workshop records, is far stranger. The visible world tells you jeweler. The invisible world tells you something else entirely. So let us start where the official story never bothers to look, at the small objects that came first. In 1853, just 6 years after Louis-François took over that Parisian workshop, Cartier began selling watches. But not the watches you are imagining, not leather-strapped instruments for a gentleman's wrist, not even pocket watches in the masculine tradition. These were watch brooches, chatelaines, and pendants made for female clients. Imagine a pin worn at the collar, delicate and ornamental, with a small timepiece concealed within its structure. Imagine a chatelaine, that decorative clasp worn at the waist from which hung chains and useful implements, now carrying a tiny clock as if it were just another elegant accessory. The watch was not the point. The ornament was the point. Time was the surprise hiding inside beauty, a secret the wearer could consult without ever breaking the spell of her appearance. Time was not the point. And yet there it was, hidden inside a brooch, a secret worn at the collar. Subscribe so you do not miss the next invisible origin that changes everything once you see it. If that starting point reshifts what you thought you knew about Cartier, leave the word brooch in the comments. I will know you paused on the same detail. That is not a watch strategy. That is a jewelry house solving a client's problem the only way it knew how, by making the functional beautiful. And it worked. The objects sold. They found their way onto the collars and waists of Parisian women who wanted to know the hour without sacrificing elegance. You have to pause here and feel the weight of that starting point. The first Cartier timepieces were pinned to fabric, not strapped to skin. They were jewelry first, timekeepers second, ornaments that happened to tell time. If you have ever dismissed a thing because it started small, because it began as an afterthought, this story asks you to reconsider. Because from those brooches and chatelaines, something entirely unintended began to grow. The clients who bought them did not want less ornament. They wanted the same beauty, but more convenient. They wanted time they could consult without a mirror, without a pause, without removing anything. And so the house moved, step by almost accidental step, from pins at the collar to something worn on the wrist. But before we follow that road forward, we have to sit with the contradiction that defines everything. Cartier did not start as a watch company. It started as a jewelry workshop in 1847. And the first watch items only appeared in 1853, and even then, they were accessories first. The myth you have heard that Cartier built a watch empire through intention and strategy is backwards. The house built its empire through ornament, through beauty, through the slow accumulation of client requests that pulled it in directions it never planned to go. 2 years earlier, before those brooches found their way to Parisian collars, before the name Cartier meant anything beyond a small workshop, the city itself was changing. In 1851, the first of the great exhibitions was drawing crowds, and the taste for precious objects was growing. But Louis-François was not thinking about exhibitions or empires. He was thinking about the craft his master had taught him. The shaping of metal, the setting of stones, the patient work of making something that would outlast its maker. The clients came to him anyway. Princess Mathilde Bonaparte, cousin of the emperor, was among the early royal clientele who purchased Cartier jewelry in the late 1850s. Think about that name, Bonaparte, a house that had redrawn the map of Europe, now buying ornaments from a young jeweler on the rise. That is the pattern that matters. Cartier did not chase royalty. Royalty found Cartier. The work spoke, and the powerful listened, and each commission taught the house something new about what its clients actually wanted. What they wanted, it turned out, was not just beauty. They wanted beauty that served them. They wanted ornaments that did things, that held secrets, that kept pace with their lives. And so, the chatelaines' tiny clock became more than a novelty. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn, where the accident becomes visible. If you have ever worn something beautiful first and useful second, you already understand what happened next. The demand did not come from a boardroom. It came from the body, from wrists that wanted to be free, from hands too busy to reach for a pocket. The demand did not come from a boardroom. It rose from the wrist itself, from hands that needed to be free. If you want to keep tracing these quiet shifts in how we carry beauty on our bodies, subscribe and stay with us. Drop the word migration in the comments if you have ever felt that your own wrist was waiting for something your pocket could not offer. By 1888, Cartier was producing early wristwatches. Not the first in history, not even the most advanced, but wristwatches that carried the house's signature philosophy into a new form. The ornament had migrated from the collar to the wrist, and in doing so, it had changed everything. Think about what that migration required. A wristwatch is not a brooch scaled down. It is a different relationship between object and body, a different weight, a different way of moving. The house that had mastered the art of the static ornament now had to learn the art of the moving one. And it did, because it had no choice. The clients wanted it. The market wanted it. The momentum of the accident had become unstoppable. In 1899, Cartier moved to Rue de la Paix, a step widely treated as a major moment in the brand's growth. Rue de la Paix, the street of peace, in the heart of Paris's most luxurious quarter, surrounded by the jewelers and couturiers who defined the era's taste. That address was not a declaration of watchmaking intent. It was a jewelry house placing itself at the center of the world that mattered to it. The world of ornament, of luxury, of the people who could afford beauty. And yet, from that address, the watch empire would eventually be born. You have walked past places like that, you have seen the windows, the glow, the impossible prices, and you have probably assumed that everything inside was the product of a plan. That is what the visible world wants you to believe. But the invisible world, the one built from client requests and craft decisions and accidental discoveries, tells a different story. Cartier was not building a watch empire. It was answering the body in motion, one commission at a time. And the most famous of those commissions would come from a man who had never wanted to wear a watch at all. Alberto Santos-Dumont was not a customer in the usual sense. He was a pioneer of the air, a Brazilian aviator who filled Paris with wonder in the early years of the 20th century. He flew, and flying required his hands. You have to picture the scene to understand what happened next. A man in the air, controlling a machine with both hands, needing to know the time but unable to reach into his pocket. It is the most human of problems, the body's limits colliding with the mind's ambitions. So Santos-Dumont commissioned a watch from Louis Cartier, a watch designed for the specific demand of flight. He needed to check the time without releasing the controls. He needed time on his wrist, not in his pocket. And Louis Cartier, the jeweler, the maker of brooches and chatelaines and pendants, listened. He understood the problem not as an engineering challenge, but as a design one, a question of how an object could serve the body in motion. The result was the Santos, a landmark men's wristwatch named for the man who had asked for it. The Santos is not an accident of marketing. It is an accident of need, of a specific human being with a specific problem walking into a specific workshop and asking for help. And out of that single commission, a line of watches was born that would define the house for more than a century. Here is what the catalogue omits. The wristwatch became central to Cartier because a pilot needed his hands free. Not because a strategist saw a market. Not because a boardroom analysis predicted a trend. Because a man flew and a jeweler solved his problem. And when you understand that, you understand the whole house. Cartier did not become a watch empire by deciding to make watches. It became a watch empire by listening to the people who walked through its doors, by taking their needs and turning them into objects of beauty. The crown did not hurt, of course. King Edward VII attributed the phrase jeweler of kings, king of jewelers, to the house, and that kind of endorsement does not fade. But the king was naming what was already true. The house had earned its place through craft, not through ambition. By the time the Santos was flying, the house had been on Rue de la Paix for 7 years. The ornaments had become instruments. The instruments had become icons. And the accident, that strange unplanned journey from brooch to wristwatch, was well on its way to becoming an empire. But the empire was not yet what it would become. The scale, the numbers, the global reach, those were still ahead. And the acceleration would come from a direction no one in 1847 could have predicted. The empire that began with a watch brooch pinned to a collar is about to be counted in billions. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because a pilot needed his hands free. Subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter in these hidden histories of craft where accidents become legacies. In the comments, share one word that captures what just shifted in your understanding of how luxury is actually built. Because the house that had started with watch brooches pinned to collars was about to be measured in billions. Not millions, billions. In 2017, Forbes valued Cartier at $7.8 billion. In 2020, that number had climbed to $12.2 billion, 3 years. And the value of the house had grown by more than the entire worth of many competing luxury empires. That is not the trajectory of a plan. That is the trajectory of an inheritance compounding. Remember the starting point. A young man took over a workshop in 1847, and the first timepieces were brooches pinned to collars in 1853. From those small ornaments, the house drifted into wristwatches by 1888, answered a pilot's request with the Santos, and never once sat down to design a watch empire. It built one anyway because the philosophy was always the same: make the functional beautiful. The family kept control until 1964. For more than a century, the Cartier guided the house, through the Mauve to Rue de la Paix, through the royal commissions, through the birth of the Santos. And when they stepped aside, the house did not stumble. It continued, because the craft had become bigger than any single family. That handover in 1964 is where the visible story ends and the invisible one begins. The name stayed, the atelier stayed, but the meaning shifted from a family's craft to a global inheritance, carried by collectors who understand that the dial is only the doorway. The brooch became a pendant. The pendant became a wristwatch. The wristwatch became the pillar of a $12.2 billion house. And at every step, the motive was the same: to answer the person standing in front of the bed, to solve their problem with beauty. So when you see a Cartier watch, when you catch its case catching the light, you're not seeing a product of strategy. You're seeing the accumulated result of thousands of quiet decisions, each one made by a craftsman listening to a client. That is the invisible machinery behind the visible dial. The collector who reads only the logo buys a name. The collector who reads the story buys an inheritance. The difference is not in the metal, it is in the eye that knows what to look for. And that is the real lesson of the accident. The house did not succeed by predicting the future. It succeeded by honoring the present, one commission at a time, trusting that beauty would find its own way forward. The empire was accidental, the craft was not, and in that distinction lies everything worth understanding about the house that was never meant to rule time, and yet does.